Good morning, philosophers. Today's class is one I've been looking forward to all semester. In my life, I've had the good fortune to know and work with many incredibly intelligent, insightful, and imaginative people. But I think I've only known one genius, and that is the author of today's reading, Parfit. Parfit, who was born in 1942 in Chengdu, China, and died on January 1st, 2017 in Oxford, was, in the opinion of many, the greatest moral philosopher of the 20th century. He spent almost his entire working life as a fellow of All Souls College in Oxford, the only college of Oxford University with no students, only research fellows. But in addition, Derek also had visiting appointments at Harvard, NYU, and Rutgers University. Parfit is especially known for his pioneering work on personal identity, on rationality, and on population ethics, the subfield of moral philosophy that studies our moral obligations concerning future people. He was also my teacher for a period of about 8 years, first at Oxford, later at Harvard. This is what he looked like by the time I met him in Oxford in 2006. Parfit wrote only 2 books in his life, but what amazing books they are. His first, Reasons and Persons, which appeared in 1984, was widely hailed as the greatest work of moral philosophy since Henry Sidgwick's Methods of Ethics, published more than a century prior. The chapter we read for today's class is drawn from that work. Parfit then spent over 2 decades working on his next book, On What Matters, and it is monumental. It was published in 3 volumes between 2011 and 2017. Some philosophers joke that it is the first book on ethics visible from space. Now, part of Parfit's genius was his capacity to discover entirely new philosophical problems. Such is the case for the problem we'll be discussing today, his so-called non-identity problem. Many of the philosophical issues we've discussed this semester have a very long pedigree. The question whether death is bad for a person, for instance, which Roman discussed in his guest lecture, has been debated since antiquity. By contrast, it's fair to say that prior to Parfit's work in the late 1970s, the non-identity problem had been noticed by literally no one. And yet, once the problem has been presented, it seems both so obvious and so far-reaching and profound in its implications that you're left scratching your head how we could have failed to notice it for so long. Okay, enough wind-up. Let's encounter the problem. We begin with a case. Imagine that a woman wants to conceive a child. Before trying to get pregnant, she goes to the doctor for a medical checkup. Upon completing the exam, the doctor tells her, "I have good news and bad news. The bad news is that you're suffering from a temporary medical condition. If you conceive a child within the next 2 months, your child will suffer from a lifelong disability, as a result of which it will have to use a wheelchair, and it will have a life expectancy of only about 50 years. However, the good news is that if you wait 2 months before conceiving, your temporary condition will clear up, and the child you will conceive won't be disabled and will have a life expectancy of about 80 years. However, because waiting would interfere with her vacation plans, the woman decides not to wait and to conceive right away. 9 months later, she gives birth to a child, and as the doctor predicted, the child is disabled and has a shortened life expectancy of only 50 years. Has the woman acted wrongly? Now, as I'm fond of saying, I can't peer through the computer screen into your minds to see what answer you would give to this question. But when I've polled students on this question in the past, only a small minority have answered that what the woman did was morally completely unproblematic. A large majority of students thinks that the woman's action was at the very least morally iffy, and many think that what she did was clearly morally wrong. After all, at a relatively trivial personal sacrifice to herself, modifying her vacation plans and conceiving 2 months later, she could have made it the case that her future child didn't suffer from a lifelong disability and had a life expectancy that was roughly 30 years longer. Given this, many think, surely it was wrong not to delay conception. So many of us have the strong intuition that the woman acts wrongly if she conceives now, rather than waiting 2 months for her temporary condition to clear up. But what exactly makes the woman's action morally wrong? Can her action said to be wrong because her action is bad or worse for anyone? It seems not. Let's assume that despite its disability and its shortened life expectancy, the woman's child has a life that is well worth living for it. The child, let's imagine, has every reason to be glad to be alive. Now, it's true that, had the woman waited to conceive, the resulting child would not have been disabled and would have had a longer life expectancy. But would taking this option have been better for anyone who actually exists? It seems not. Why? Because the child the woman could have conceived in 2 months' time, Parfit argues, is not the same child. As philosophers say, the child that the woman could have conceived 2 months from now is not numerically identical to the woman's actual child. Let me explain that technical term for you. So, philosophers distinguish two senses in which two things can be identical. To say that X and Y are numerically identical is to say that X is the same individual as Y. For example, Cassius Clay is numerically identical to Muhammad Ali. Clark Kent is numerically identical to Superman. I today am numerically identical with myself 15 years ago when I was about your age. By contrast, to say that X and Y are qualitatively identical is to say that X and Y are alike in all their relevant properties, but are not necessarily the same individual. So, for example, 2 cans of Campbell's tomato soup or 2 $20 bills are often qualitatively identical. But they are not numerically identical. They're not the same individual. By the same token, I am numerically identical to myself 15 years ago, but alas, not qualitatively identical. Now, the sense of identity that is relevant in discussing Parfit's non-identity problem is numerical identity. So, what exactly is the non-identity problem? It is this. Our intuitive responses to a case like temporary condition are in tension with one another. Specifically, we are tempted to affirm 3 judgments, each of which seems plausible and attractive in its own right, but which cannot all be true. As we philosophers say, the 3 propositions form an inconsistent triad. First, we're tempted to say that an act A is wrong only if there's some existing or future person whom A affects for the worse or who is harmed by A in the morally relevant sense. Colloquially, no harm, no foul. I think it's an extremely natural thought that for an action to be morally wrong, there must be some person who in some sense is negatively impacted by that action. So let's give a name to this thought. Let's call it the person affecting claim, or PAC for short. Second, it seems plausible that an act A which creates a new person P, or which results in the creation of P by other people, does not affect P for the worse, or harm P in a morally relevant sense, if the following 2 conditions are satisfied. First, person P has a life that is worth living, and secondly, had this action not been performed, P would never have existed. But in spite of these first 2 propositions, it also seems true to many of us, we said, that some acts that create a new person with a life worth living are wrong, even though they do not affect anyone for the worse or harm anyone in a morally relevant sense. So this third proposition seems true, for example, in a case like temporary condition, where by delaying conception, the woman could have conceived a numerically different child whose life would have expectedly gone considerably better than the life of the child she actually conceives. The non-identity problem, then, is the question how to respond to the tension between these three intuitive judgments. Intuitively, what the woman does in temporary condition is morally wrong. So proposition 3 strikes us as true. But if proposition 3 is true, we must reject either propositions 1 or 2, and vice versa. And if we do reject proposition 1, the person affecting claim, what takes its place? What story can we tell about why the woman's action in temporary condition is wrong, if not because it negatively impacts some person? Now you may be thinking, okay, nice philosophical puzzle, but what's the big deal? Isn't the kind of procreative problem that arises in temporary condition rather rare and artificial? Why should the rest of us be concerned with the non-identity problem? In other words, it may be tempting to think of the non-identity problem as just some obscure philosophical puzzle that only occurs in rather unusual procreative contexts. But that reaction would be dead wrong. In fact, once you really understand the non-identity problem, you will start seeing it everywhere. It pervades our ethical lives. Notice, for example, that the non-identity problem crops up not just in individual procreative choices. It also bears on many society-wide policies. Let me give you an example. Our response to global climate change. Now, if we fail to address global climate change, people born in the year 2100 will have lives that are blighted by frequent droughts, heat waves, more extreme storms, a loss of biodiversity, and so on. Many of us think that it is seriously morally wrong to fail to address climate change for that reason. Yet can this be because failing to address climate change would be worse for the set of people who will be born in the year 2100? No. The people born in 2100, if we fail to address climate change, and the people who will be born in 2100, if we do address climate change, are not the same people. Why? Well, think about it. To get serious about climate change, to really begin to make a dent in this problem, would require a serious society-wide effort. We'd have to change many of our methods of industrial production. Entire industries, such as the fossil fuel industry, would have to begin to be phased out as we transition our economy to cleaner sources of energy. We would also have to retool our dwellings and change our patterns of settlement and commuting. In other words, getting serious about global climate change would be akin, in some respects, to putting our society on a war footing. But these society-wide efforts that we would need to undertake in order to address climate change will inevitably affect when people meet and have children. A lot of relationships, for example, are started at work. So as society's patterns of work change and people work in different jobs than they would have in a business-as-usual scenario, different people will meet, fall in love, and have children. Such changes, moreover, have a ripple effect that grows larger with every passing generation. In sum, it is highly likely that by the year 2100, not a single person who is born, if we fail to address climate change, would have also been born had we successfully addressed climate change. We're talking about two sets of future people that are numerically entirely non-identical. But if that's true, then addressing climate change would not have been better for the people who will be born in 2100 if we fail to seriously address climate change. For had we done so, they would never have existed in the first place. what follows from this is that if we continue to affirm our judgment that failing to address climate change is seriously morally wrong, as I think we absolutely should, we must find a new basis for this moral judgment. If Parfit is right, failing to address climate change is wrong, but it cannot be wrong because doing so will be worse for the people who will then be born in 2100. But there's more. The non-identity problem doesn't just complicate how we think about the future. It also has puzzling and troubling implications for how we think about the past, in particular about the topic of historical injustice and other tragedies in human history. Take the example of World War I. Intuitively, we all have reason to regret that World War I occurred. Think of the horrors of trench warfare. Think of the approximately 15 million soldiers and civilians who were killed, and the roughly 20 million wounded or maimed for life. Think of the disastrous longer-term consequences, including World War II, that World War I precipitated. In sum, it's fair to say that World War I was probably one of the worst self-inflicted catastrophes that ever befell humanity. And any decent person, we might think, should regret that such a terrible thing ever happened. Yet, imagine that World War I never occurred. Suppose that Gavrilo Princip had never assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and the whole bloody slaughter never got off the ground. Well, in that scenario, it is extremely likely that none of us, not me, not you, not any of the people we love and cherish, would ever have existed. Once again, had the world-transforming event of World War I not occurred, the lives of our great-grandparents would have gone very differently. Many of them would have met different partners and had had children with them. And again, such changes have an ever-growing ripple effect over time. So, for reasons that parallel the case of global warming, it is extremely likely that no one who exists today would have existed had World War I not occurred. Other people would have existed, perhaps in a happier, more peaceful world. But none of them would have been you or the people we love. And of course, the case of World War I is just an illustrative example. The same could be said, for example, of the transatlantic slave trade, or the genocide of indigenous peoples in North America, and so on. Most large-scale disasters in human history have fundamentally altered the makeup of the human population. So, realizing that much that we love and cherish exists only because certain historical injustices and tragedies took place is an uncomfortable thought. Can it be decent to affirm our own existence and those of our loved ones, we might wonder? Can it be decent to be glad that we are alive while realizing that we are only here because some of the worst tragedies and crimes of human history took place? Does affirmation of our own existence crowd out regret about the past? Or can these two attitudes rationally coexist? If you'd like to delve deeper into the question how the non-identity problem complicates our relationship with the past, I warmly recommend to you a recent book by the Berkeley philosopher Jay Wallace, The View from Here, on affirmation, attachment, and the limits of regret. This book grapples with exactly these questions. It's a marvelous work. I really recommend it to you. So I hope that this first part of my lecture has given you a sense of what a gripping and pervasive problem the non-identity problem is. I now want to go through the problem again with you, more slowly, carefully examining its philosophical presuppositions. In discussing the temporary condition case a moment ago, I claimed that, according to Parfit, the woman's child, despite its disability and its shortened life expectancy, is not affected for the worse or harmed by the woman's choice to procreate when she did. This is so because, first, the child has a life that is well worth living for it, and second, had the woman not chosen to procreate when she did, this child would never have existed in the first place. So let's pause and look a little more closely at each of these claims, starting with the second. Why should we believe that if the woman had followed her doctor's advice and delayed conception by 2 months or more, the child she would have given birth to in that scenario would not have been numerically identical with her actual child? Why couldn't the woman have had the same child in both scenarios? In the chapter from Reasons and Persons that you read for today, Derek Parfit argues in support of a claim which he dubs the time dependence claim. It says, I quote, "If any particular person had not been conceived within a month of the time when he was in fact conceived, he would in fact never have existed." Now, this claim, Parfit argues, will be true on any plausible theory of personal identity, of what makes you you. The job of such a theory is to state what Parfit calls the distinctive necessary properties of a person, that is, the properties that this person could not have lacked and which are only had by this person. One such theory is what Parfit calls the origin view. It says that each person has this distinctive necessary property, that of having grown from the particular pair of cells from which this person in fact grew. In other words, had a person not grown from the particular pair of egg and sperm cells from which they in fact grew, they would never have existed, according to this theory. A numerically different person might have existed, but any person who grew from a different pair of egg and sperm cells would not have been them. So, if this origin view gives a correct account of the distinctive necessary properties of a person, then we should accept the time dependence claim as a matter of fact, if not of metaphysical necessity. Women ovulate roughly once a month. So the particular egg cell that was fertilized when the woman in temporary condition got pregnant would no longer have been around if she had delayed conception by 2 months or more. So it is true, as a matter of fact, that whatever child she might have conceived after waiting for 2 months or more would have grown from a different pair of sperm and egg cells. Hence, according to the origin view, this child would not have been identical with her actual child. But suppose you reject the origin view as an account of the distinctive necessary properties of persons. Suppose you think that what makes you you is not the fact that you grew from the particular pair of sperm and egg cells that you grew from. Rather, your distinctive necessary properties are your most important distinctive properties, those that might be used to pick you out through a description of you. For example, what you look like, some of the most salient things you did in your life, and so on. And let's assume that these distinctive properties do not include having grown from a particular pair of cells. But Parfit argues that even if we accept such a descriptivist theory of personal identity, we should still accept the time dependence claim. For if you hadn't grown from the particular pair of sperm and egg cells that you grew from, and if your genes consequently had been different, it is highly unlikely that the resulting person would have had exactly the same distinctive properties as yourself. They likely would have looked a little different. The story of their life would have gone very differently, and so on. So again, even on such a descriptivist view of personal identity, the time dependence claim comes out as true. If a person hadn't been conceived within roughly a month of when they were actually conceived, it is true as a matter of fact that they would never have existed. So in sum, it looks like we're on pretty solid ground in asserting that had the woman in temporary condition delayed conception by 2 months or more, her actual child would never have existed. What about the other claim, that in procreating when she actually did, the woman didn't harm her child in a morally relevant sense, since the child has a life that, despite its disability and its shorter life expectancy, is well worth living for it? What can we say in support of that claim? Well, for many philosophers, the notion of harming a person is an essentially comparative idea. They would embrace the following claim. An action harms a person if and only if it makes the person worse off than she would otherwise have been if the action had not been performed. If that is how we understand harm, can the woman in temporary condition be said to have harmed her child in choosing not to delay conception? Well, no. Had the woman delayed conception, her child would never have existed at all, instead of existing with a life that's well worth living for it. So it's hard to see how what the woman did could have made her child worse off than it otherwise would have been. If she'd acted otherwise, the child would never have existed in the first place. Okay, but perhaps we think this purely comparative conception of harm, according to which I can harm a person only if I make them worse off than they would have otherwise have been, is too narrow. Suppose, for example, I create a person with a life that, due to some rare congenital condition, is so full of unremitting pain and suffering as to be not worth living for that child. Now, although it isn't clear that we can coherently say that I make this person worse off than they would otherwise have been, because if I hadn't acted in this way, they wouldn't have been at all, could it not be plausibly claimed that I nonetheless harm this person by bringing her into a life of such unrelenting misery? I think this is plausible. So, if that's right, then we should perhaps broaden our definition of harm. We should say that an action harms a person if and only if it either makes this person worse off than she otherwise would have been, or else causes her to exist with a life that is, all things considered, not worth living for her. But even on this expanded conception of harm, what the woman does in temporary condition will not count as harming her child, because despite its disability and shorter life expectancy, this child's life, we've assumed, is well worth living. It'll contain many joys and worthwhile experiences, many fulfilled desires, many deep relationships, and so on. Moreover, the only feasible alternative for this child is never to have existed at all. So given this, Parfit thinks, it is plausible that the woman's choice to create the child can't be said to have harmed her child or affected it for the worse. All right, let's take stock and see where we stand. In setting up the philosophical puzzle of the non-identity problem, we saw that the problem can be captured through a set of 3 propositions, each of which seems plausible on its face, but which turn out to be mutually inconsistent. They can't all be true. So we began this lecture by reviewing the case for the 3rd proposition. I gave you a case, the temporary condition case, in which what a woman does is intuitively morally wrong, but where her action seems not to affect any presently existing or future person for the worse. And just now, we've examined the case for proposition 2. I explained to you why, according to Parfit, it's not plausible to claim that the woman in temporary condition has harmed her child or affected it for the worse. So where does this leave us? If propositions 2 and 3 are both true, well, this logically entails that proposition 1, the person affecting claim, must be false. In other words, we would have to accept that an act can be wrong even if there is no existing or future person whom the act affects for the worse or harms. But that still leaves a lot to explain. What story can we tell about why the woman's action in temporary condition is wrong, if not because it negatively impacts some person, all things considered? If the person affecting claim is false, what can take its place? In the philosophical literature on the non-identity problem, we find 2 kinds of answers to this question. The first kind of answer tries to solve the non-identity problem by appealing to people's rights. According to philosophers such as James Woodward, the person affecting claim goes wrong because it has too narrow an understanding of what can make an action morally wrong. So according to these philosophers, an action can be wrong not because it affects someone for the worse, all things considered, but because it violates their rights. Let's consider an example. Suppose that a traveling Sikh businessman is prevented from boarding a flight by a bigoted flight attendant. The flight attendant sees the man's turban and thinks, "That guy is a terrorist," and bars the man from boarding the flight. The businessman protests his innocence, but it's to no avail. So, stewing with rage at this blatant act of discrimination, the businessman returns to his hotel. He lies down on his bed, flips on the TV, and then his jaw drops. CNN is reporting that the very flight he was supposed to board crashed just after takeoff. There are no survivors. It's clear to the businessman that had he been on that flight, he would now be dead. Now, given what I've just told you, it seems that the businessman has not been harmed or affected for the worse by the flight attendant barring him from boarding the flight. To the contrary, if he'd gotten on the flight, he would now be dead. Instead, the man gets to enjoy another few decades of happy life. But does this mean that the flight attendant's action wasn't wrong after all, because it didn't end up affecting the businessman for the worse? No, we want to say. The discrimination was still wrong because it violated the man's rights. He had a valid ticket for the flight. He was not a terrorist. He had every right to be on the flight. The flight attendant acted wrongly by going against that right, even if, as it happens, the man turns out not to have been made worse off by the action that violated his rights. Now, Woodward thinks that a similar kind of move might provide a solution to the puzzle of the non-identity problem. Granted, he says, the woman in temporary condition does not harm her child by creating it. But couldn't her action be wrong nonetheless because it violated a right of the child? Say, a right to a life that isn't burdened by a congenital handicap or shortened life expectancy. One attraction of this kind of proposal is that while it involves rejecting the person-affecting claim, as I stated it earlier, it is still a person-affecting idea in a broader sense. It's consistent with the rights-based proposal, after all, that the wrongness of an action always has to be explainable in terms of its effects on actual people. Where the person-affecting claim, as we formulated it, goes wrong is that it only looks at effects in terms of people's welfare, rather than also taking into account the effects of an action on people's rights, independently of their welfare. However, I think that, promising as it may seem at first blush, there are in fact very convincing objections to this attempt to solve the non-identity problem via an appeal to rights. We can see this objection by considering a variation on the temporary condition case. Let's call this permanent condition. So imagine that everything is as in temporary condition with one difference. This time, when the woman goes to see her doctor, she's informed that her medical condition is permanent. Any child she could conceive at any point in her life would be born with the same medical condition as the child in temporary condition. Suppose that having been given this information by her doctor, the woman decides to go ahead and conceive a child. 9 months later, a child is born, which suffers from a congenital handicap that requires it to use a wheelchair throughout its life, and the child's life expectancy is only 50 years. But again, despite these burdens, the child's life is well worth living overall. What do you think of the woman's action in this permanent condition case? Is it permissible, or is it just as morally iffy as that of the woman in temporary condition? Well, I can only speak for myself here, but to me, the woman's action in permanent condition seems much less morally problematic than the woman's action in temporary condition. By procreating, the woman gives her child a life that is well worth living. And moreover, unlike in the temporary condition case, This is the best kind of life that the woman could have given to any child she conceives at any point in her life. I think it's hard to see how, given these two facts, the woman's action could have been morally wrong. The problem for a proponent of the rights-based solution is that he's committed to denying this very intuitive verdict. If the woman's action in temporary condition is wrong because it violates a right of the child she creates, as he asserts, then the same must be true in permanent condition as well. For the effect on her actual child is exactly the same in both cases. Think of it this way. In temporary condition, the woman has 3 options. 1. Don't conceive any child. 2. Conceive a child with a medical condition. 3. Conceive a numerically different child without the medical condition. By contrast, in permanent condition, the woman has only 2 options. 1. Don't conceive any child. Or 2. Conceive a child with a medical condition. So the rights-based proposal amounts to saying that choosing option 2 in temporary condition is wrong because of its intrinsic properties of that outcome, namely that it will result in the creation of a person whose rights are violated. But if that is so, then choosing option 2 in permanent condition would also have to be wrong, since it has the same intrinsic properties. But intuitively, choosing option 2 in permanent condition isn't wrong. So I think that this gives us pretty strong reason to doubt that the rights-based proposal can ultimately be the right way of solving the non-identity problem. All right, so having looked at one unpromising attempt to solve the non-identity problem, let us now turn to Parfit's own proposed solution. Parfit, too, believes that the non-identity problem reveals that the person affecting claim has to be given up. According to Parfit, the actions of the woman in temporary condition are wrong, not because she harms or negatively impacts anyone by procreating early, or indeed because she violates anyone's rights. Rather, her action is wrong for a more impersonal reason. There's a comparatively much better state of affairs in which other people with happier lives exist that the woman could have brought about instead, a trivial cost to herself. Failing to bring about such a better state of affairs, when doing so would have been relatively easy for you, is wrong, Parfit thinks. The wrongness of the woman's action is a function of the moral opportunity cost of her action, we might say. Her action was wrong not because of anything intrinsic to that action or to how it affects people, but because the woman had available to her a superior course of action. This is why the woman's action in temporary condition is wrong, but the woman's action in permanent condition is permissible, since in the latter case, the woman lacks a better alternative. Instead of the person affecting claim, Parfit thinks we should appeal to the following impersonal moral principle to guide our actions in cases where we can impact both the level of well-being and the identities of future people. This is his principle Q from chapter 16. If in either of 2 possible outcomes the same number of people would ever live, it will be worse if those who live are worse off or have a lower quality of life than those who would have lived. But whether our action leads to a worse outcome because the people who exist are made worse off than they could have been, or whether it leads to a worse outcome by preventing the existence of a set of different people who would have enjoyed a higher quality of life, that makes no moral difference, according to Parfit. Our reasons to prevent the latter are just as strong as our reasons to prevent the former. So much for Parfit's own solution to the non-identity problem. But now I want you to notice something interesting. Doesn't Parfit's principle Q remind you of a view that we encountered right at the start of this semester, namely classical act utilitarianism? According to classical utilitarianism, recall, an action is right just in case it produces at least as great a net amount of well-being than any other available action. Isn't that just what principle Q also tells us to do, in cases where in each of two possible outcomes, the same number of people would ever live, but the people in one outcome are better off than the people in the other outcome? If you see a tight connection between principle Q and classical utilitarianism, you'd be quite correct. Classical utilitarianism, in fact, entails the truth of Parfit's principle Q. Principle Q, we might say, is a special corollary of the broader theory of utilitarianism for the special case in which, no matter what we do, the same number of people will ever live. Hence, utilitarianism appears to give the right answer to Parfit's non-identity problem, whereas ethical theories that embrace the person-affecting claim founder in the area of population ethics. That's interesting, isn't it? At many points in the semester, we've noted various problems for utilitarianism as a moral theory. But is this now the moment where the empire strikes back? Should we perhaps say that, whatever problematic implications utilitarianism may have for other domains, when it comes to our duties concerning the creation of future people, classical utilitarianism is perhaps the best guide we have? If only life were so simple. Alas, it turns out that classical utilitarianism has very serious problems of its own in the domain of population ethics, which Parfit explores in later chapters of Reasons and Persons. I want to end my lecture today by giving you a flavor of these problems. The non-identity problem is what Parfit, in today's reading, calls a same number choice. It is not a same people choice, because depending on how the woman chooses to act, whether she conceives right away or waits for 2 months and conceives then, different people will exist. But it is a same number choice, because whichever option the woman chooses, the same number of people will ever live. But not all our choices concerning future people are like that. In many contexts, we can influence not just the levels of well-being and the identities of future people, as in temporary condition. We can also influence how many of them there will be. These are what Parfit calls different number choices. And it is in the context of thinking about different number choices that classical utilitarianism runs into problems. Let me mention the most famous, what Parfit dubs the repugnant conclusion. So, suppose that the utilitarian has a choice between causing either an outcome in which 10 billion people exist, all with a very high quality of life. Let's call this outcome A. The alternative is to create a far, far larger population, outcome Z, but one in which every individual person's life would be barely worth living. Now, the utilitarian, it seems, is committed to the view that outcome Z is a better outcome than outcome A, and ought therefore to be chosen, since it contains a larger total amount of well-being than A. This is so even though everyone who exists in outcome Z has a life that is barely worth living, whereas everyone who exists in outcome A enjoys an excellent life. This strikes many as very implausible. Parfit himself calls this a repugnant conclusion. One of the most important unsolved problems in population ethics is to articulate a principled moral theory that gives the right answer to the non-identity problem without forcing us to embrace the repugnant conclusion or any other unacceptable claims. Parfit calls such a theory Theory X. Yet such a theory turns out to be devilishly hard to find. For example, you might initially think that there's a simple tweak to classical utilitarianism that would help us get both the right answer in the non-identity case and would at the same time avoid the repugnant conclusion. I'm referring to the view that is known in the literature as average utilitarianism, according to which the right action is not that which maximizes the total, but rather the average level of well-being in a population. And you're right, average utilitarianism does render the correct verdicts in those two cases. Yet average utilitarianism, it turns out, has unacceptable implications elsewhere. For example, it implies that it would be morally wrong to create a new person, even a blissfully happy one, if doing so would lower the average level of well-being in a population, because the already existing people are even happier still. Likewise, average utilitarianism implies, again implausibly, that it would be morally right to create a new person, however miserable, if doing so would increase the average utility of a population, because everyone else is even more miserable. But that seems simply crazy. We don't make a bad state of affairs better by adding yet more miserable people to it. Parfit's book, Reasons and Persons, came out in 1984. For the past 35 years, philosophers have been trying to crack this problem, trying to find theory X. Yet despite the best efforts of some of the sharpest minds in the discipline, theory X remains elusive. So, in the space of less than an hour, we've together traversed the space from the beginnings of population ethics to the frontiers of our philosophical understanding. Perhaps the person who will take the decisive next step on these problems is watching this lecture right now. Only time will tell. In the meanwhile, I very much look forward to discussing the many fascinating questions raised by Parfit's text at our final town hall the week after Thanksgiving. Until then, philosophers,